Gentlemen, it's been a while. I'm recovering from a flu, as you can hear, but really enjoyed last week's discussion. Sorry to have missed out. Really thought we were going to talk about Anthropic's entry into healthcare, but I think something bigger happened earlier this week. Pryce, talk to me about Epic and Health Gorilla, man.
Yeah.
What's going down?
So I posted on LinkedIn this week trying to explain the Health Gorilla Epic lawsuit for beginners. First of all, the background is that these nationwide networks have existed for a long time where you can exchange lots of healthcare data, right? So folks who might be newer to thinking about healthcare data portability, they just downloaded ChatGPT Health and they're realizing they can pull their charts or something to that effect. Well, doctors have been able to do that for a long time. Premise is that when you request that data on one of those networks, for the most part, at the current moment, you pretty much need to be treating a patient. That's called the treatment purpose of use, which is outlined in HIPAA, right? Those purposes of use for data are outlined in HIPAA law, so it's super old now. But the networks are primarily for providers who are providing healthcare, and it's very common for there to be cases that are a little bit gray. Like, what about an application that wants to join one of these networks? It's not the EHR, but it is a provider facing application. So it's still a provider who's the user. It's still a provider who might be saying, I need, Brendan's chart to treat him. I'm going to make a treatment request query. And then you start to see further edge cases and further edge cases and maybe eventually fraud is maybe how you would define it. Like, nobody's treating these patients. Maybe I jumped in too fast to what's actually happening here, but the idea is that these nationwide networks exist pretty much for physicians to query each other for clinical data, and it's common for non-physicians to try to figure out how to get onto the network. Not really so that they can query for charts and sell them on the black market, but more like, benign things like, I'm kind of doing treatment, but it's really more like care management and analytics on, the data quality, or sorry, the clinical quality of my patients or something to that effect. So, Brandon, what were the current cases that we actually saw called out of? There was one that was Segretort, right? And then there were one or two more. Do you want to lay those out?
Full history is in April, May of 2024, we saw Epic levy a dispute in care quality, not a lawsuit, but dispute against Particle Health, saying that several of their customers, Integratort, um, uh, was one that focused on mass-tort, so it was very similar pattern-wise to what we see here. Revelier focused on sort of payer and data exchange and things like that, alongside providers, and a few others. And so that progressed as a dispute, and then eventually, given some of the lack of resolution there, other grievances by Particle, they decided to levy antitrust claims and other claims against Epic in the Particle v. Epic lawsuit in September of that year. And that's progressed. We're seeing other battlefields emerge in the data wars, or we want to call this. And that's a fun name for the podcast, who knows? But those are more focused on business associate applications connecting to EHRs and on behalf of providers and being blocked from doing so. That's the general theme of that bucket. This bucket, which was a bucket of one really until now, is about these networks that facilitate a particular type of access being used in more creative ways. And the boundaries of that creativity, the gray zone, if you want to call it that, are where the disputes happen. What's being alleged here is a tactical strike by Epic. They're not going after the gray zone area use cases. They're not going after the things that we might say, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good. They're helping people, right? There's different boundaries to what is treatment by a provider and what might help people. And because of the difference there, we see people trying to help people and do good things potentially break the rules as written of these networks. For this particular lawsuit, it is less in the gray zone if the behaviors alleged are true. It is in the black zone. It is the mass-tort where lawyers are taking populations of data, demographics, searching for those patients' information, identifying patients with particular conditions or exposures. And in this case, PFAS exposure is named in the suit, right? They say that all of these deal with this exposure to, a PFAS, some sort of chemical, and then marketing lawsuits to them. That is something where like, I don't think anyone's going to go on a stumping for that. So be like, oh yeah, you know what we want? Lawyers just randomly pulling my data and marketing lawsuits to me. Like that is a thing that has very little sympathy across the industry if proven true. And that is why this case is hyper focused in a way that the first dispute was not, because things like patient access to data, patient involvement in clinical trials, patients, or payers having access to data for value-based care, like those are things that could do some good in the world and I actually support that, right? The popular sentiment is something quite different. And so that's why this case is so focused and shaped the way it is. It's very intentional in that regard.
Okay, well, I want to interrupt because I've learned all of this from working with you two, but not all of us started our jobs working in EDI and being deeply embedded in this space. I think maybe helpful is, what does this ecosystem look like right now? Just briefly, the networks, the nationwide networks that we're talking about, why do these on-ramps like Health Gorilla exist? Who are their customers? Who are they partnering with? Pryce, you want to start?
So there's all sorts of on-ramps. The idea is that we have nationwide networks. First, Epic created, I think, Care Everywhere to sort of say, hey, if you're on an Epic instance, then we have created this method for you to exchange charts with other Epic community members, with other Epic sites. And we're calling it Care Everywhere. And it's, CDA exchange, it's clinical document architecture exchange of sort of chart summaries or discharge summaries and things like that. And then other EHRs were saying, okay, well, how are we going to compete with the network effects of this EHR that's allowing its customers to exchange healthcare data with each other for the purpose of continuity of care? I forget what it was called at the time, but it eventually evolved into eHealth Exchange, or was that Commonwealth? Brendan, you'll have to remind me.
So prior to Care Everywhere, there was the National Health Information Network, which was the government, like Bush and them being like, all right, let's like get something together. That was pushed to the private side and became eHealth Exchange, but it was hospital systems opted in and the vendors couldn't join as directly. What sort of flipped and led to rapid growth with Care Quality, or Everywhere, then Commonwealth, and then Care Quality, is a vendor-led approach to allow for distribution, right? Build the capability and then distribute to customers. And so it was, eHealth Exchange, then you had Care Everywhere, and then Commonwealth as sort of a response from Oracle, Cerner at the time, Meditech, et cetera, to say, well, what's better than just one EHR is multiple exchanges.
Interesting. So what you're saying is almost like eHealth Exchange was originally like, okay, individual provider systems should opt in. But then that's like creating a phone network where everyone has to like connect their own phone line, right? And then the next step was like, well, if we want broader distribution, let's say all Epic customers can use Care Everywhere, or all Cerner customers can join Commonwealth, or all Meditech customers can join Commonwealth. And then we evolved to, okay, well, let's just connect Commonwealth and Care Everywhere and eHealth Exchange so that they actually share the same phone book and trust framework. The important part here is that any one node who makes a query across the network to another node that says, do you know Brendan and may I have his charts, must inherently trust that they are providing treatment at this time. And now we've evolved into TEFCA. Care Quality is by far the most used network of all of these. But TEFCA is the newest iteration. There's lots of exchange happening on TEFCA. Epic is pushing to TEFCA, but they've sort of abstracted even further to now say, like, not even each of the EHRs have to opt in or opt out to join these networks, but let's create our own cell carriers, and those are called QHINs. One of them does happen to be an Epic product called Nexus. One of them is No2. One of them is Health Gorilla. And so these qualified health information networks are beholden to really high standards, but they're the ones who allow others to onboard to this network, and they can commercialize that onboarding in the same way that Verizon and AT&T do. And the tricky part for me, as someone who used to work at an on-ramp at Redox, I know that we are vetting potential customers who want to use us to on-ramp to these networks for the right use case, for the right reason, for following the rules to join these networks. Once they're on the networks, you sort of are trusting each of these individual nodes that they're doing what they say they're doing, which usually is saying, I'm providing treatment and here's an episode, and I'll respond to the network with the new data that I create. And largely that's unpoliced. But when you have an organization big enough that exchanges enough healthcare data, I imagine that they can start amassing or looking at patterns in data exchange and saying, that node asks for a lot of information, but never responds with information, or they always respond with information that's the same as the information that we provided them. And then you can start asking yourself, like, are they actually doing what they say they're doing, which is having an encounter with this patient, creating new clinical observations, new clinical notes, running labs, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why when I wrote about this, I was thinking Epic must have a smoking gun, because it can be very obvious if you actually open up all the charts, crack all the charts that you're exchanging with these nodes. It should be very obvious whether or not they're actually providing treatment. Wouldn't you all agree?
Yes and no. Just one quick detour back to the history part before we dive into the nuances of the case, which I think you're starting to get some of the meaty good questions. But one interesting facet of the history is when these networks started, they were EHRs as the on-ramps, right? And whether that's QHIN or Care Quality Implementer or Commonwealth Service Adopter, the names change for each of these networks, but they're all on-ramps. So you're not just wiring up your own connection to the phone network. There was a change to allow for Commonwealth connectors and Care Quality, I forgot the name of them, but like non-EHR entities to on-ramp to the networks to make it simpler, to add value, similar to what Stripe does for credit card networks. And what's interesting, that drastically increased adoption to a tail of the technology vendors that didn't have the aptitude or insight or technical expertise to use CDA and XDS and all those things. At the same time, the business incentives of on-ramps are dramatically different than an EHR. An EHR is a sustainable business, or can be a sustainable business, depends on the quality of the EHR, if they sell to providers for the purpose of providing care and doing back office stuff and things like that. The access to the networks is a value add feature to make things easier in pursuit of that. On-ramps as a business model need to sell access, and they need to provide value to sell access. And so their levers to make money, presuming they do not have other business lines, are add more value, do deduplication, do augmentation, do whatever it is to add more value on top of what's the commoditized rails, right? Like the rails themselves, the network itself is the same for one on-ramp as the next. But like the things you do on top of it in terms of searching for records more efficiently, augmenting, like that's value add. So that's one lever to differentiate and sell. The second is the ways that the APIs or UI or other types of data exchange presented to potential customers. Those different formulations of GraphQL or REST or a cool clinician user interface, like those are other ways to differentiate, both product-based differentiation, both at the value add level and at the presentation and modality level. Price is another, not price, but cost is another way of differentiating. So as on-ramps come in and are selling the same thing, essentially they can offer cheaper price to some limit. And the last is creativity on the bounds of whom to sell. And that is one of the pressures we see, that on-ramps in this race to compete with one another continually look over at one another and say, wait, that other on-ramp seems to be selling to this use case, servicing employers or with providers who are AI agents. And there's this erosion of, as they try to compete, to say, well, they're allowed to sell, I should be allowed to sell. And some of it, no one's selling to that group. And it just becomes a slippery slope that we proceed down in terms of the competitive nature, that being one angle and aspect pushing us towards this outcome, because the businesses want to survive. And so you look at the available levers and pull them. There's no right or wrong morality to that. It is just how capitalism works. Going forward, so that's the history piece that I think is really, really important in underpinning some of what's pushed us here and why we see tension between EHRs, Epic, but some other EHRs, and the on-ramps in particular. On the smoking gun, I think it's an interesting question. Like in the legal case, you would expect a smoking gun to be given in the complaint, right? Use that, because the first thing that's going to happen is a motion to dismiss. Like you have to have something that warrants a court case. Court cases are expensive, and generally speaking, you don't proceed to the answer and counter complaint you get a motion to dismiss or some other motions for jurisdiction, things like that. So you would expect that here. And if you have indisputable evidence, sometimes you save it, but like a lot of times you want to get through to the next stage. What do they have in there is important to examine. They have traffic patterns. There's these spikes and things like that. Is that proof? No. But is it indicative of something? Maybe. There's some compelling stuff. They have perspective on like a twisted web of relationships between parties and counterparties that they believe to be alleged fraud, right? That is the claim in there. And then they have some detail, but not a ton of detail about the data returned. They basically just say, yeah, the data returned is not that great. The data returned has this PFAS stuff listed in it. Make no mistake, they're trying to get to discovery, to get the actual smoking gun, to say, hey, to the world that, hey, we're not insane. Because that is the goal of this lawsuit, more so than anything. Epic trying to have a strong, indisputable proof point of true abuse that very few people are going to support, so they can hold it up to the world and say, look, we're not crazy. They need to get to discovery to be able to pull the things to get to that outcome. So they have enough of a smoking gun they think to do a lawsuit, but do they have enough to get to discovery? TBD.
Okay. So at one point in history, the EHRs were the only ones sitting on the oil well, right? Like they have the resources. And what I mean by resources in this case is the supply of clinical data. And really, the EHRs exist not to mine clinical data and make money from it, but to allow clinicians to document it and to be paid and things like that. It just so happens that it becomes a very valuable asset. And then it is somewhat advantageous to EHRs to say, I'm going to protect this asset in any way I can. The government has forced them to be able to, to share it, especially between providers or for patients who are asking for their data. But then on-ramps that aren't EHRs kind of come in and say, well, how can I help? It's almost like Google Flights making me never want to go to the United Airlines website or the American Airlines website to schedule my flight because it's better, it's easier. And that's probably a huge bummer for United and American. And so it's just fascinating to hear you talk about that and how eventually what happens is this network goes from like pure trust, like everyone on the network has an EHR and they must be doing treatment, to like who is on this network, who's querying for data, what are they using this data for? And the EHRs are incentivized to sort of be like, well, patient privacy, but it's also advantageous to their business to not sort of readily allow the commoditization of the data. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
There is that view, and that underpins one perspective. Everything's 2D, but everything is actually 3D, right? And so there's multiple perspectives on this. One is, this is data, it's valuable, that's being mined. EHRs are trying to stop it. Possibly true. Also possibly true is that when this was designed, it was for transitions of care between healthcare organizations to replace that specific workflow that was a fax. And so it wasn't this idea of like, we are like exchanging data and making it like a data collaborative. It was like, okay, we're doing literal documents, CDA documents, to send over the wall for a transition of care. There is a demand signal from all this that is being surfaced, that people are looking over and say, well, I still have a bunch of faxes. I still have a bunch of manual work for entirely different workflows, like payer provider data exchange for HEDIS or quality measures, like patients accessing their data and then providing it to clinical trials or to a lawyer or to a life insurer. All these unmet demand signals that do not have ubiquitous national infrastructure. People are looking and say, well, that piece of infrastructure, we could use it for that. They're trying to find a way. And so by and large, this is an unmet demand signal. These people are trying to do good and help somebody, but the contours of the rules as they were written, because it was in order to stand up and get to ubiquity, it was predicated on, this is just for transitions of care. Because when it started, Dr. Pryce was looking over at Dr. Brad and he was saying, if I share my data with Dr. Brad, he's going to poach my patients. He's going to go and steer them right to him. And so they said, this has to be for treatment for transitions of care and not for marketing and operation stuff. That was the only way that all these providers signed up for it, because they were deathly afraid of abuse and fraud. And then as they realized the advantages of it, they overcame their hesitation. But that is being potentially undone in this era. Meeting that demand will allow us to have the same realizations about payer-provider data exchange. That all the fear and uncertainty and doubt we have of payers denying claims or whatever, we're going to be like, oh wait, actually everything's more efficient when we don't have a bunch of stupid faxes. That is my true belief, but like, it's a bet.
It's a spectrum. Everything is a spectrum here, right? I'm not saying like EHRs are mining things that are valuable and then hoarding it, like we've talked about. It's just there is obviously, even if you just say it would be advantageous to the EHRs to continue to curate this network such that providers trust it. That's true, right? Like any network, you don't want a bunch of Uber drivers who cancel your, ride requests. And in the same way, you don't want a bunch of nodes on the network who you think are actually mass querying for a specific type of person who could be part of a, class action lawsuit. And so it's definitely not like one party's evil, one party's right. At the end of my post, I specifically call out a concept that Brendan talks about, which is we need to continue to encourage the exchange of this data in more and wider use cases. We just need to do so responsibly. Instead of saying, no, nobody can do it, we need to regulate it heavily and make sure that it's done appropriately so that people continue to trust these networks and continue to use them so they don't wither, die on the vine like chat roulette, which was fun for 10 seconds until half the network was not fun and nobody wanted to go on chat roulette. You know what I'm saying?
Any network, any form of communication has fraud and abuse. That's a good point. It's a joking point, but chat roulette was like a fun way of communicating. But then you go to the next one and see something you don't want to see.
Yeah.
Like that happens on every network. Visa, MasterCard have fraud and abuse. Telecom, people are calling and trying to get your social. Email, your grandma is getting, mined for X, Y, and Z. Like the ability to communicate en masse gives new routes for people to take advantage of other people. And so it is not about categorical elimination of fraud and abuse. That is not how it works. That's not how human nature works. It is about the detection, the auditability, and the action against those parties to protect the value of the network, of any network. And so like that is what is posited in the complaint by Epic to be lacking, right? That one of the other reasons that they chose their particular tactics here is because they say, hey, the existing networks don't have the right patterns and paths to enforce this, and we need to take this in our own hands. And like, okay, white knight us like that, like way to go, Epic. Some of the verbiage about it is a little melodramatic, but like court briefs typically are. But it's their true belief. Like it shines through that they think that they needed to take this to court. One, to get the discovery, to find things out, to prove it out. Two, because they don't think they can do so through other pathways. And that may be a shame because it hurts existing networks. It hurts the ability for networks to self-govern. Like Visa doesn't go straight to court with people. They have processes for resolving fraud and abuse. That's an intrinsic functionality of a network. And so it hurts any network when those are not steadfast, reliable constructs.
So one more quick question. Epic is claiming that this abuse is happening on multiple networks, right? Both CareQuality and Tefka.
That's right.
Is that accurate? Okay. So they're all kind of exchanging the same thing, slightly different technical or governing, entities, very similar motions, very similar rules. And we're seeing what we think is very similar fraud across multiple of these networks.
That's right. This is the first complaint, the first of this bucket of things that mentions Tefka in addition to CareQuality. Brad, I want to pause here. Are we too deep in the weeds? What are your thoughts about this whole kerfuffle?
Yeah, I think good of Epic to white knight us. We've got OpenAI and Anthropic now saying like, hey, individual, forget about using a doctor to get this information or a healthcare provider. Just you have the right to go grab it all and dump it into our system. I don't want to be a pessimist, but I feel like that network or that data acquisition pattern actually has a lot more opportunity for fraud. Maybe that segues us into the other giant announcement coming out of JPM this week.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit last week about OpenAI, but Anthropic joined the fray. And that, to your point, is using patient access pathways. It's those demand signals coming from the dispute are in some ways being met. The growth of individual access services framework on TEFCA and potentially through the CMS aligned networks too, that is giving a paved path for certain use cases to identity proof the patient, use that proof of identity to pull data across the same rails or roughly the same rails as the treatment exchange, and thus like reduce the demand that's being routed through treatment. And if you can do that, if you can meet the demand, most people are going to choose the paved path instead of off-roading it and doing something new and creative. That's exciting. People are all up in arms about Anthropic's implementation, ChatGPT's implementation. These are the worst they're ever going to be, right? Like they're only going to get better in terms of network reliability, the coverage, the ability to parse and understand that data. And so I'm optimistic about all these things because they're meeting people where they are. And at least if there's going to be fraud and abuse of some sort, at least in this pattern, it is indisputable that the patient is involved in making a choice, right? You are proving your identity and you can be deceived and we can try and be paternalistic and block and say, oh, we can't let them choose or make bad decisions. But that is one of those topics that just you sit either in one pole or the other. And that's what you believe about paternalism. My general thought is if we know this sort of stuff is going to happen, we might as well make it indisputable that when Pryce's data is pulled, that it's Pryce who's saying it should be pulled. And if that had happened in this situation, in the court case with Health Gorilla and their customers, it would be not in that dark, eerie, scary zone, but more in the gray zone of like, okay, but the patient wants this and wanted this. Then you were talking again about the contours of treatment versus the contours of are we helping people? And that will always be an area of the Venn diagram that people will debate.
What do you mean by that? You're saying, do we not trust patients to take care of themselves and therefore we don't trust them with their data? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying so long as we're litigating the boundaries of treatment, that circle of what is treatment is smaller than what are the things that could be done good in the world with health data, right?
Oh, what's happening is that circle is like a pressure cooker right now with everyone trying to jam not really treatment into, I need this data for treatment.
100%. That's it. That is the catalyst. That is the driver. That is the reason for all this to happen is because there are good things to be done with easier access to healthcare data that the current networks do not facilitate. And until they do in a paved pathway, like we're just going to keep quibbling over what is treatment because people are going to keep either through ignorance or malice, they're going to say, well, this network could do a lot of good if it was used for individual access, if it was used for operations, if it was used for payment. And they're not wrong. But the difference between what is written into the rules about something and where we need to go, that's period, full stop.
I'm trying to remember this too. Who solves for those problems? In care quality, it would be the recognized coordinating entity that pushes new like standard operating procedures out into their network and their network participants. But then everyone has to be on board with them, right? So it's the RCE who's in charge of that, which is the Sequoia project.
There's no one in charge. It is a collaboration. It is the government. The government in the US is not able, the federal government is not able to go at very often be like, you got to go do this. Even the certification program, right, is voluntary with like the tie-ins to CMS. It is not thou shalt everyone in the country go do this. Like we because of federalism have very convoluted levers to get things done, especially in health technology regulation. And so ASTP is lightly given a mandate via voluntary network via the Cures Act to say in the Cures Act, it says ASTP has to go and make this voluntary nationwide network voluntary. It doesn't give them authority in terms of incentives or anything like that. The CMS is taking the CMS health tech ecosystem approach of just sort of creating a voluntary pledge and things like that. But like they're not telling because they don't, until they have authority from Congress, they can't tell people what to do. And so they can incentivize and encourage the collaborations necessary. They can try and shift through the statutory authorities they have the equilibrium to overcome natural incentive structures of capitalism, and the inabilities of competitors to work together collaboratively. And so creating the right incentive structures, allowing people to understand and work together with one another despite differences. That's really hard. Building a network of any kind is really hard, even for a small geography, let alone for something as varied and disparate as the United States of America. And we're trying to do that not once, because we've done it once for treatment, we're trying to do it again for individual access, again for operations, again for payment. And to do that over and over is not one job to be done. It is separate stakeholders, separate incentives, a separate set of competitive solutions in terms of existing networks and pseudo networks. And so the job is really hard. It's really hard to convince
Yeah.
people to collaborate.
So, and that's what I'm hearing is like, at its core, you have these trust networks where you say everyone on this network has to trust each other and you have to follow the rules. But everyone on that network, and again, this is pessimistic or cynical, but it's true that they might be competitive with each other. And then you tell them that it's all sort of voluntary. And it's like, of course, you're getting not only sort of disagreements in the actual operation of these networks, but then disagreements in the regulation of these networks, like what the next rule should be. And then you get a whole new network made because you're like, okay, we'll start over and everyone try with Tefka and we'll have the QNs be in charge of this. That's the frustration that I'm starting to realize. And in the last 3 years, I feel like I've gotten to the point in my career where I see policy and I see bigger economic impacts and I see capitalistic organisms moving around. And I'm like, they're swimming upstream. And it's frustrating, but that's why we have the ASTP. That's why we have the RCE. That's why we talk about people need to start getting used to these new use cases because they are going to be good, especially if they're done responsibly, if they're implemented responsibly. And IAS, I think, is actually one of those. I should say IAS is individual access services. So we've been talking about providers using their electronic health records basically to query other providers for charts. And then we jumped over to also one of the things that these networks support is like Brad having Be Well on his phone, having OpenAI on his phone, or Brendan having, Fasten on his phone and being able to reach out to the network and say, I am this patient, give me my data. That's moving closer from I used to write checks and have to sign them to like now actually I just double tap my phone and like give someone my credit card information when I want to pay them. So much better.
That's a great analogy. I like that.
It does seem like IAS is this, apart from treatment and providers exchanging data, like IAS to me, the next obvious, like, this is golden. Everybody should want to be able to access their data. And it's just really hard to create the rails on which people can do this in a trusted manner. So I don't know if that leads into.
I just want to say, like, creating the rails isn't the hard part. Actually, the hard part is these implementation guides for individual access have existed for a long time in these networks and seen little adoption because the economic incentive isn't there, right? Like it's hard to see the benefit as a health system or whatever when you weigh it against the risk, right? With a HIPAA risk of like, what if it's an accidental disclosure and I have a breach? When a breach happens, it's not just the fines that come from the government. You get all these people in like Texas and Florida that like are like, oh wait, I can do some lawsuits. Oracle had a breach kind of quietly last spring, right around HIMSS, and huge class action lawsuit. There's new people joining every day. Like, I didn't receive timely notification. Now I've found my data on the dark web. When this happens for a health system or a provider or a tech vendor, like you're in for a world of ongoing hurt. Well, if there's not upside to this in terms of financial upside, and there's huge financial downside and risk because of HIPAA and the security rule and things like that, then why am I prioritizing this of the many other things that I could do versus payer provider data exchange or whatever, or just like internal operations? So like that is the underpinning reason that they haven't jumped on board with this. But with the demand signal of the particle and epic kerfuffle, that incentivized people to go, oh wait, no, we got to figure this out, because if we don't have a path here that's safe, people are going to off-road it, and that path is going to be really unsafe. That's what's prevented. It's not that it's new or novel, or even building the rails are particularly hard. Incentive structures matter there. And so the demand signal plus some of the government saying, actually, we're not going to really chase you down for a breach if something happens here lightly. They haven't really promised that, but in the CMS health tech ecosystem, they said something akin to that is enough to start to move the ball forward here.
The reasoning behind certain parties being actively against or for these things is all economic, it's all capitalistic with my pessimism. When you lay it out like that, very simply and plainly, you're kind of like, that's just an object in motion tends to stay not in motion. Why would they develop this until someone pushes them to do so? Or there's financial incentive. Like,
If you think about any time your reason for something is moral in nature, so like, for instance, EVs for years saw limited adoption. Why did electric vehicles see limited adoption? It's because the incentive structures weren't there when it was a moral choice, when they did not perform at a comparable level at the same price point as traditional vehicles. And so when the incentive structures changed by virtue of Tesla and other private companies, and the government also being like, all right, you get some money, right? You change the incentive structures, and suddenly a moral choice becomes an economic choice, and you see far greater adoption. But the percentage of the population that operate in the face of economic decisions choose morality is unfortunately a subset of the overall population.
Right. So we all got to go back to the part of our job that pays us. But I think we're talking about networks broadly here. Let's talk about a private network, something that popped up in our internal Slack, that fun topic of conversation to close us out. Availity and Abridge had a really exciting announcement. As a patient, I would be very excited about not having to wait weeks for prior authorizations to be done. Who wants to tell us about what Availity and Abridge do and why it made sense for them to announce partnership to get rid of the headaches of prior authorizations at point of care?
The backlog this week's been insane. It's on my list, but the hits keep coming. So Availity, one of the largest clearinghouses for all the administrative transactions of healthcare in the country. So with the Change Healthcare cyber attack, Availity is now largely considered by most to be the preeminent clearinghouse. Waystar, Change, and Availity are the big three, if you will, for traditional claims and eligibility and those sorts of transactions. So they're out there. They're a network that's been there for ages for these administrative transactions. Bridge, the well-known ambient scribe, one of the leading LLM products in healthcare. It's like them and Open Evidence as the two poster children. They are the ones who have been burnt by Epic and things like that historically. They partnered with Availity for the purposes of prior authorization. And so what have they done here previously? Well, the ambient scribe workflow started with, I am talking to Pryce. I'm the doctor. I'm saying, yo, Pryce, how's it going? I do my whole conversation. I'm not typing in my keyboard anymore. And it surfaces back via LLMs the note and says, here's the note. Is this right? You edit some things and you save it. That is the most basic piece of what a scribe can do. And scribes are evolving to be ambient co-pilots, that for every keystroke that a provider needs to do, if you can generate and do that for them, or at least save them some of that work, it is real ROI. That is really valuable for happiness and all these things. And so what are the other keystrokes? Well, typing in orders. Well, many are working on that. Putting diagnoses and other discrete information in. Well, many are working on that. Coding, the encounter for proper reimbursement. You better believe many are working on that, given an even more crystal clear ROI narrative. And now we see another job to be done is providers have to do a lot of work on prior authorization, the approval of procedures and medications when they're financially, expensive, and when they, might not be the right course of care. It's debatable. Like, we don't need to go down what prior authorization is and the two sides of it, but it is work. It is administrative burden. And hypothetically, a co-pilot can use the ambient conversation and clinical decision support and the documentation templates that are required by different payers to pre-fill that out and save a bunch of keystrokes and work. And so Abridge did this with Highmark, one payer, to prove things out. Hypothetically, they did that very well, and they proved it out and said, there's real ROI. We did this well enough. And they said, well, shit, there's a lot of payers in the country. How do we scale this puppy up? And they chose a leading administrative network to facilitate that. So it's not surprising. They're two great partners, even if the name sounds good, Abridge and Availity. Like, how cool is that as a pairing? And you can imagine that other scribes are pursuing this, like, are going to want to do this. But there's a lot of other jobs to be done of surfacing clinical trials, of inserting care gaps and clinical decision support, the convergence of all the ambient co-pilot jobs to be done. This is just another manifestation of that. So I haven't written about this, but I have written about that convergence that we're seeing across every keystroke is up for grabs for co-pilots. And very logically, we're going to see all those jobs to be done converge into single platforms.
One of the most interesting parts about this is that many of the jobs that those ambients are trying to do they're reliant on one source of data. So they go and they integrate with the EHR. I'm sure there are other examples of this, but this feels like the first one that's broken through to me of the ambients going and finding external data networks to accomplish these jobs.
You're right to call that out. It's not, I don't think it's a manifestation of that. Maybe I'd go back and read the press release, but like this is more like I need to send the transactions, right? I need to communicate with payers for the different pieces of prior auth of like, what are the documentation templates? Let me just send all the documentation and the prior auth information to the payer. That's probably in inbounds and like using it for surfacing and pulling other information. You're right to call that out. There are scribes that are doing health information exchange. They're pulling in the longitudinal record in addition to EHR data, ambient data, HIE data. Maybe in the future we get visual data. Like the inputs are one competitive surface for this product type. The jobs to be done are another competitive surface. And then, of course, there's the user interface and the modalities that they express through that could be very infrastructural, like we see with how Epic is approaching it now with you can have these different scribes on the back end, but the front end is art. They've reduced the scribe in their ideal workflow to a back end infrastructural capability, or it can be very user interface and like you're pulling the provider totally away from the EHR to a net new experience, which is where most of the VC upside is in that potential future.
So really quickly, the jobs to be done for prior auth are basically, can I give Brendan an MRI? And then the response from the payer is, well, it depends. What's Brendan's chart like? What have you tested him on so far? What are his diagnostics so far? Is he actually sick enough? Then the provider responds. Then you can continue with the procedure if you get it approved or not, if you don't get it approved. And the way that the Da Vinci spec, coming out of HL7 says that this should be done is one API call that's a quick clinical decision support hook. Do I need prior auth at all or no? And then the second step is, if yes, give me a questionnaire of things to fill out. And that's a FHIR formatted questionnaire. It's very structurally sound. It's very discrete. But I really want to know, like, how is the ambient scribe responding to this discrete questionnaire? It's going to use CQL, isn't it? I don't know very much about CQL, but it's going to use like a very structured FHIR forward language to answer questions from the EHR. And now I'm so like perplexed as to how, AI is going to generate things to respond to that.
We're coming up on time, but you're right to highlight that as a tension point, that prior authorization is a lot of burden, an administrative burden, and that there are many, many companies vying for facilitating this. There are technical standards on the payer and provider side that are being implemented to facilitate this, but they're hardly the only way to do this. And we're going to see people using portals and phone lines and all these different things, many different routes people are pursuing in terms of solving the prior auth problem. We should, at a future episode, dig into the details there and talk about those different parallel paths, if the audience is interested in that line of pursuit and inquiry. But until then, everyone have a great weekend.